Hello, I'm Jeff Stanley with Stanley Handcrafted, and today we're going to be talking about wick guides, choosing the right wicks in 464, and kind of a brief overview on some important things to think about when you're choosing your wicks for not only 464, but any wax in general. Now, I've already made a full video that goes into using 464 in the jelly jar, which is probably the most commonly used jar amongst any new candle maker or any candle maker period, actually. It's one of the most widely used jars. It's nice, it looks great. People really go for it. You can get a bunch of different colored lids for it to really kind of customize it to your aesthetic and your style that you're going for. But not only that, it's an easy one to choose. And like I said, I made a full video where I went into detail on this one. I chose 5 different wicks. I chose the Eco wicks, the LX wicks, the HTP wicks, the CD wicks, and the hemp wicks. And I put all of those wicks in 3 of each. So I put 3 CDs, 3 Ecos, LX, HTP, hemp, and everything into 3 separate jelly jars. And then I basically went through, added the fragrance oil, added the wax, and then burned all of those just so I could get a real good overview and a good look at how the different wicks burn inside that wax jar and oil combo. And basically the goal with that video was to show people, like really get in depth and show the 3 different wicks in that wax, and then show the difference between the LX and the hemp, or the CD and the Ecos, just to see what they do and how different they can perform. And that video is uploaded over on the membership portal, and that's basically, we've been getting a lot of requests for some online learning, so that video is part of the learning modules. So it's like a 30-minute long video, and it's broke up into a couple different parts. And the first is going over the wicks, the second is going over the actual burn test, and then the third portion of that is going over and talking about the hot throw from each of those sets. And of course that link is down in the video description down below. But basically what I wanted to talk about in this video is getting into choosing the right wicks and going through and looking at a lot of the wick guides that are out there, and kind of throw caution to anybody starting out looking at these wick guides. I wanted to highlight that's exactly what these are. They're guides. They're meant to show you approximations of what would work depending on the wax, depending on the jars. It's not always going to be exact, and that's where this video really highlights that. So as you know, a lot of the jars that I use the HTP wicks for the 2 different main jars that I use, which is the 8-ounce jelly jar and the 9-ounce straight jar. And I typically use the HTP 83, 93, and the 104, depending on the wax, depending on the oils, and depending on those 2 jars. Those wicks usually work really well, but when you start jumping into other wicks, and like you've seen in some of my previous videos, sometimes those wicks can be too big or too small depending on what you're putting in there. So depending on the oils that you do, that can affect the wick and the hot throw and the melt pool. And then of course, depending on the wax, it's going to make a huge difference. So the HTPs tend to burn a little hot. So if I'm going to use an HTP inside of like a Parasoy wax, and I move to a soy wax, I'm probably going to wick down. And that's going to be the same for any of the other wicks. So the CDs, the Ecos, LX, anything like that. You're going to want to choose those and do a lot of different testing. And that's where the wick guides are a great help. But again, they are a guide. They're not going to be an exact, you're not really going to be able to go on there, find the jar and find the wick, and you're off and set. It's gonna go. You're absolutely going to want to get that and test it just to make sure that that wick and that wax and the jar combo actually work together. And then I'll go ahead and splice in some of the videos just to give kind of a sneak peek at what some of the wicks were doing inside those. And I found a lot of differing wicks in there, and some of the wicks that I thought were going to work inside of that jelly jar actually didn't work, and some of them worked really well, which really highlights the point that the wick guides that are out there are merely a guide. They're meant to point you in the right direction. You can see in some of the videos that like the CDs or the LX or the Ecos, a wick that's labeled or kind of measured for a jar at like 2.75 inches, you can see that the melt pool is really deep. And again, that's why it's a good idea to really take notice of the wicks that you're getting and really recognize and test and understand what they do. So if you're getting a wick like a hemp wick, which burns really hot, you're going to want to really test that one going into soy, which is a low melt point wax. Now, I didn't get to test every single wick in this one. There was a few others like the Premier wicks. There's some RD wicks that I want to try out, and then of course the Zinc Core wicks I haven't gotten to try either. So I'm going to get some more of those. We're going to do some more testing, and those will be up on the channel as well as the modules, just to give kind of an overview of kind of what I think about those, what they look like, and to give you guys an idea of how they burn, how they look when they burn, and how they act when you add different oils to them also. And that was the next portion of the video that I wanted to get into. Is another reason that you need to test different oils is not every single wick. Like when you find the 9-ounce jelly jar, the HTP 104, and you're using like a 6006, different oils can affect that very differently. Different oils can basically ignite or be a little bit more or less flammable than some other ones. So if you have a 9-ounce jelly jar, the HTP 104, and an oil that burns a little bit hotter, that wax is going to burn a little bit more than it normally would. Or so that candle could essentially burn through in like 35 hours instead of a normal 40 hours. That's why it's a good idea to check. So in an example like that, if it's burning hotter with the oil, you would want to wick down a little bit. So go from the 104 to the 93, and you'd bump your candle back up to the normal 40 hours that you're used to. The other wick that I left off of this test are the wood wicks, and the reason I did that is because a lot more people use the cotton wicks, so I wanted to really focus on those because that's what people go to first. The wood wicks, which I love, but they're definitely a little bit more of an intermediate to advanced wick to use, just because they can be real tricky trying to get the right wick into the right jar. And the reason that is the cotton wicks, you can get the wicks that go up from basically from diameter to diameter. You can get like a wide range of wicks. So that when you get a jar, you can find a wick pretty much that will match that jar depending on the wax and the oil combo that you're using. Whereas wooden wicks, they'll go from a small to a medium to a large pretty quickly, and there's a big jump between some of those. And you can narrow it down a little bit, but basically going, like if you had a scale from like 1 to 10, whereas the cotton wicks go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way from the scale. The wood wicks are going to skip some in between. They really don't have a good in between sometimes, so you might get a 1, 3, 5, 7, and you might hit or miss. So if you're going from like a 5 to 7, inside of the wrong jar, that 7 could be just a little bit too much and it will burn, and the melt pool's a little too big. And then the 5 would burn a little bit light, so you wouldn't get a full melt pool. And there's really no number 6 in there. I hope this metaphor is playing out, but there's basically no metal, or there's no 6 in there to hit that jar perfectly. So that's why wooden wicks, I always tell people to wait once you get the candle process down, then jump to the wooden wicks, because they can be frustrating. And when you're first starting out candle making, just getting everything down is already frustrating enough, and adding in another frustration on top of that is just gonna add to people not wanting to continue. And then of course, along with the wick guides, of course I mention it in every video, but that's the DIY Facebook group. I've got a link for it down in the description down below. It's just over 17,000 members in there. That's another good place if you can't find something on the wick guide, or if you're not sure on the wick guide. There's a lot of people in there that are very helpful, and they can tell you, some people will tell you exactly what wicks they're using inside of a certain jar. So if you're using like the square Libby jars, or the 9-ounce straight, the jelly jars, or if you're double wicking, they get a little bit harder to match up and find the right wick for those. So there's a lot of people in there that are very helpful, and they'll tell you kind of a starting point of where to go for some of those jars and some of those wicks. So the biggest differences I noticed with a lot of these wicks are really subtle, but they're really good. And that is a lot of wicks, when you get them, you really need to pay attention to how hot they burn. If they're a hotter burning wick like the LX, some of the HTPs, and of course the hemp wicks, if you're going into a lower melt point wax, you're going to want to wick down on those. And some of the cooler burning wicks, not that they're cool, they're burning, but some of the ones that are on the lighter side, some of those you might have to wick up in some of the other waxes. So if you're using like a Parasoy, a wick that you would think, or does normally work in a 3-ounce or a 3-inch jar with soy, if you're moving to Parasoy, which is a little bit harder wax, you're probably going to wick up one at least, if not 2, depending on the wax and the oil that you're using. So with the video that I recorded, we really went into depth on this one because we wanted to make the entire module really good for people that are jumping into it and wanted kind of a little bit more in-depth knowledge on the wicks. So we basically go into the wicks, talk about each one, what makes them different from the other ones, and then I've got a full recording of adding all the wicks, pouring all the wicks, and then we took each of the jars, poured them up to about 3/4 of the way, and then lit them for a couple hours just to watch the different melt pools between them. So in the video you can see that we've got 15 candles burning at the same time, and just looking at all the different melt pools, looking at the different wicks that are mushrooming, the ones that are not, the ones that are standing straight up, the ones that are curling. And then of course the third portion of that video is hot throw. And if you've watched my videos, you know that I take all my candles into the bathroom. It's a real controlled environment, so I can tell exactly how strong the hot throw is. If it's in the bathroom, if it's coming out of the bathroom into the bedroom and then into the hallway, I can really get a good sense of how the candle and the wick and the oil and everything is throwing. And that's what I did in the third portion of this video, was basically took a set of the HTPs and burned it for a couple hours. And then the next day took the CDs and did the same thing. And then a couple of them I did first thing in the morning and then later at night, so that I could really get a good sense of which wicks were probably throwing the best. And again, that full video, along with a bunch of other stuff from my partner Shauna Klein in the Innovative Maker with this one. She has a bunch of PDFs and videos that go into a lot of the social media and business side of things. So if you want to see that module, I've got it listed in the links down below in the video description. So please jump over there, take a look at that. And then of course, all the normal links are down below. I had a lot of people ask about the gear that I'm using, like this camera right now. I had a lot of people ask about that one, so I've got links for some of that stuff down below if you want to check it out. I've of course have links to all the social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, the website, the email address. Anything that you need to do to get in touch with me is down below. And if you have any questions on this one or the membership or anything like that, please ask in the comments down below. I try to go through and answer every single one of those. And of course, last but not least, jump over to the DIY Facebook group if you want to get into more discussions and interact with a lot more people that kind of have their hands full with this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of people over there that are very helpful, and they can jump in and kind of fill in some of the questions or answers that I can't field myself. And of course, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thank you.